Hello, my name is David Stirrup and I'm Professor of American Literature and Indigenous Studies here at the University of Kent. My research focuses on Native American and Canadian First Nations literature and art, but I'm a citizen of one of the nations that colonised the Americas, and I work within 50 miles of what historians of colonial Britain refer to as the heart of empire. So inevitably my work is always concerned with the relationship between Indigenous, colonial and settler colonial agencies. Today I want to talk about my current project, which pretty much exemplifies that convergence. Beyond the Spectacle is a collaborative 3-year project investigating the cultural, economic and political impacts and legacies of 5 centuries of travel by native North Americans to Britain. We tend to have a strong sense of the impact that British travellers to the Americas had. We have a far dimmer understanding of the impact on these shores of visitors from Turtle Island, the common Native American name for North America. So today I want to tell you a series of anecdotes, stories that illustrate and illuminate the diverse range of peoples who have come here on official business and the diverse range of reasons for their visits, as well as trying to give you a little insight into what they experienced here and how Britain responded. So I'm going to set the scene on a few examples and then track back through them to try and bring some individual voices to the foreground. On a freezing April day in 1887, the steamship SS Nebraska dropped anchor just off Gravesend. Its 14-day sea voyage across the Atlantic had been rough, treacherous at times, and its occupants, many of whom had been very reluctant travellers from the start, had no doubt wondered whether their destination would ever be reached. It was certainly delayed, not least because they were held there at the mouth of the Thames while customs and quarantine officials poured through their documentation before permitting them to proceed upriver to the Royal Albert Docks. There began the disembarkation, according to Alan Gallup, of around 180 horses, 18 buffalo, 10 elk, 10 mules, 4 donkeys, 2 deer and 5 Texas Longhorn steer, as well as a company of over 200 led by the infamous William F. Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill, all en route to Earl's Court and their showground beside the American exhibition. That entourage included 97 Native American men, women and children, Arapaho, Kiowa, Pawnee, Cheyenne and many Oglala Lakota, the people of the famous Crazy Horse. From 1891 onwards, they were the only tribe from which Cody hired. If you know anything about the numerous cultural groupings of Native American nations, you'll recognize all of these as Plains tribes, those we most closely associate with the horse-riding, feather headdress-wearing warriors of the West. In fact, many of these individuals had participated in the so-called Indian Wars, such as the battle at Greasy Grass, commonly referred to as Custer's Last Stand. And less than 3 years after Cody's arrival at Gravesend, the massacre of more than 150 Lakota at Wounded Knee Creek would see the end of hostilities, but not the end of either state coercion or native resistance to it. So imagine the scenario. These people of the inland plains had not only just endured over 3,000 miles of treacherous water, a trip many of them were nervous about making, and several weeks of confinement, but now found themselves entering a strange, crowded city in a foreign land indirectly responsible for their recent displacement. And to cap it all off, they would be performing scenes for Cody that reenacted their defeats to the US cavalry. Among the questions that first spring to mind are what did the British think of them? And more to the point, what did they think of the British? Never before had such a large contingent of native travellers been seen here in Britain. And of course the scenes they performed were the stuff of sensational news and fiction, thoroughly out of place on the scrubland of Earl's Court or up on Manchester's racetrack. Before I begin to explore those questions, however, I'd like to tell you a few more stories of arrival. We could, for starters, jump back to 1577, to the entry to InterBristol of 3 Inuit, a man, woman and child, who were captured on Baffin Island and brought to England by the explorer Martin Frobisher. Frobisher's captives were not the first. Indeed, as early as 1501, 2 anonymous men thought to be Inuit were documented in the environs of Westminster Hall. We know little about any of these figures. The 1577 trio, who weren't a family unit, I should note, have names of sort. Calico, the man, Ignorth, the woman, and Nutak, the baby. But in the case of woman and child, both names are simply anglicizations of the Inuktitut words for woman and child. We know too how those who encountered them responded. We have no real record, however, of their experiences or responses. In November 1577, the man and woman died within a week of one another. Nutak, the baby, survived only a further 8 or so days. Similarly, we could pause on 1616, the year John Rolfe brought his wife, Lady Rebecca, to London, partly as diplomatic emissary for her people, partly to raise funds and goodwill for the Jamestown settlement back in Virginia. The English Civil War and ensuing disruption would mean that the next diplomatic emissaries from native nations would not arrive for nearly 100 years. Born Amanute, but later taking the name Matoaka, Lady Rebecca was of course more popularly known by her childhood nickname Pocahontas. The Rolfes travelled to London with their young son Thomas, where Matoaka was introduced to the great and the good of London's upper crust, including the royal court. Again though, and for all our familiarity with the mythology that has grown up around her, knowledge of the woman herself, her thoughts, opinions, feelings, and certainly her experiences of travelling to London are largely left to conjecture. Her voice silenced by the spectacle and an imperfect archive of the spectacle itself. Less so, though, for her kinsman, Uttamatamakin. Through conversations with Englishmen John Smith and Samuel Purchas, Uttamatamakin left a relatively no-holds-barred insight into his impressions. Speaking of no-holds-barred accounts, two later visitors, the Mohegan preacher Samson Akhom in 1766 and the Anishinaabe performer and impresario Mongwudus, or George Henry, left brief but illuminating accounts of their journeys. The former, a Christian convert who travelled to Britain with Presbyterian minister Nathaniel Whitaker to raise money for the Christian education of native peoples, was also under pressure to represent his people's interests in increasing tension over land disputes back in Connecticut. Charismatic and articulate, Occam gave more than 300 sermons in the course of 2 years and raised nearly £12,000 in the process. Similarly educated in mission schools, this time in Upper Canada, George Henry turned his back on the Methodist Church in the 1840s, reverted to his Anishinaabe name Mongwudus, and set about establishing a troupe of performers to tour cities in the eastern United States and Europe. Swapping the shores of Lake Huron for Portsmouth in 1845, Mongwudus and his troupe of fellow Mississaugas represented a rare thing for the time, an Indigenous troupe travelling under the direction of an Indigenous rather than American or Canadian impresario, and entirely under their own steam. Or almost entirely, since as historians Donald Smith and Cecilia Morgan illuminate, Mongwudus, like other Ojibwe visitors in the 1840s and 50s, were given immense support by religious groups, particularly the Quakers and other humanitarian and religious societies. With some success on their own, the troupe soon journeyed to Paris to team up with American painter of the West, George Catlin, whose epic series of paintings of scenes and people of the Western tribes, known as the Indian Gallery, was then on display. Like Occam, Mongwudus left a written account of his and his people's experiences here and impressions of the people and places they saw, and formed what one anonymous writer called a friendly union with many on his travels. For my final anecdote, I want to jump forwards a little over a century. While the examples I've given so far have figured in the scholarly archives to varying degrees, we're also engaged in archival research, both filling in detail in the known stories and drawing out stories that haven't yet been revisited. In 1971, for instance, Dolores Manyfingers was selected to participate in a new Commonwealth exchange programme. From the Kainai Reserve in Alberta, Dolores was the only First Nations member of a Canadian contingency of 15. Dolores lived for 2 weeks with a family in Surrey and then spent her third and final week in Maidstone in Kent. In the same year, in fact in the same month, a group of 40 Blood and Piegan students from the Kainai Reserve arrived in the Essex port of Harwich on a month-long tour of Europe, taking in parts of southern England, France, Belgium, Italy, Germany and Switzerland. Organised by a teacher from St Mary's School on the Reserve, the trip was intended to give the students a better understanding of the peoples of the world and help them to become aware of the social changes in the world today. It was partially funded by the Youth Travel Exchange Programme, partly by parental donation, and partly by tribal and private funds. Like any other educational trip, the children were taken to see the sights: London, Salisbury, Sevenoaks. Not quite sure how Sevenoaks made it in there. They crossed to France from Dover, of course, so they were given a highly select snapshot of Britain, taking in a flavour of both its modern and ancient environments, and Sevenoaks. Quite wonderfully, the Kainai News published a series of postcards that some of the children sent back to family on the Reserve. So I want to start tracking back through perceptions from here. Colin Manyfingers, possibly a relative of Dolores, wrote home to let his family know that, quote, the food is no good. A rather ubiquitous viewpoint among tourists to the UK, I fear. Another, simply titled AF, writes to Dad, Phyllis and everyone, London sure is different. It feels so crowded. Bet you if you were bigger than me you couldn't turn around without bumping something. These reports allow a little insight into the excitement and credulity of a group of children who boast of getting things for free, express awe at the city, and also admit to feelings of loneliness. Similar sentiments are clear in Dolores' more solitary experience, but she also elicits a much more explicit sense of being a representative of her people. They hardly know anything about Indians, she says. They think we still live in teepees. They would not believe I was an Indian, her report to the Kainai News continues, even when I assured them I was. This sense that Dolores has of representing her people, of course, illuminates not only her own responses to a foreign country, but British perceptions of her and expectations of native people more broadly. Expectations that were conditioned, certainly reinforced, by the visit of Buffalo Bill earlier in the century. Dolores also makes comparisons to home in the same way that the other Kainai children do. Out in rural Kent, for instance, she notes that, quote, the country was small. Sometimes I had to laugh at the little children when they said things like, look at that big combine, or look at that big farm, because compared to here, these things were so small. Other comparisons are more favourable as she reveals that she, quote, never faced any discrimination from either the other Canadians on the tour or from the people in England. Such a statement could likely not have been said of her experiences back in Alberta. Meanwhile, her landlady in Maidstone cried when she left because, quote, she did not wish to see me go. These children came as tourists and students, but in doing so, they became part of a centuries-long tapestry of Indigenous visitors to these shores. Their adolescent observations are, of course, far less sophisticated than those of the adults who preceded them, such as Mongwudus, but they are of a piece with the curiosity and comparisons that earlier visitors expressed. They abound as well by what Cole Thrush describes as an oft overlooked fact, that as much as Britain is the heart of empire, it's implicated in these native travellers' lives in a myriad ways, and that in travelling to that centre, they are in fact travelling to the periphery of their own worlds. Mongwudus reminds us of this fact in his use of metaphor, interpreting the city of London through objects and symbols of his homeland. In his 8-page pamphlet, an account of the Chippewa Indians who've been travelling among the whites, for instance, he would note, among other things, that like mosquitoes in America in the summer, so are the people in this city, in their numbers and biting one another to get a living. Like many native visitors to Europe, his observations of inequality, poverty and industrial living reveal much both about the values he brought with him and the attitudes of the British towards the poor and needy, towards their own society, and of course towards foreigners, particularly those as exotic as these traditionally dressed performers. Such reflections further collapse the perceived hierarchy between centre and margin. In the main, Mongwudus observes good treatment, if somewhat tinged by an uncomfortable fetishism. His observations are also often very funny, not least when he visits royalty, describing Queen Victoria as, quote, a small woman but handsome, although there are many handsomer women. Her guard, meanwhile, described as 7-foot-tall warriors because of their helmets, quote, do not shave the upper part of their mouths, but let the beards grow long, and this makes them look fierce and savage like our American dogs when carrying black squirrels in their mouths. Such culturally relative comparisons heighten our sense of his understanding of audience, while shining a spotlight on our own exotic difference. In slightly more reverential tones, Samson Acham in the mid-18th century tells in his letters and diaries of observing the king in his robing room, fine dinners, and meetings with the great and the good of church and state, just as native diplomats and missionaries before and after him did. His reception speaks to the status of his circle of acquaintance, but it also indicates the high degree of curiosity that most Britons had about the indigenous peoples of what were still the North American colonies. Like other visitors, both native and non-native, Acham expressed his shock as, stepping out into the city, he, quote, saw such confusion as I never dreamt of. And like Mongwudus, he reserves particular notice for, quote, the poor beggars praying, crying, begging upon their knees. Acham toured throughout England, Scotland and Ireland, where he drew huge crowds to listen to his sermons. But he and his companions were very cautious about letting him be seen in public, understanding that he would become a spectacle. Writing in anger about the uses to which his fundraising was later put, Acham gives some sense of exactly how it felt to do the work he did, writing, I was willing to become a gazing stock, yea, even a laughing stock, in strange countries to promote your cause. He leaves us then with a very palpable sense of the weight of the colonial gaze, although he also takes us beyond the spectacle, highlighting his own agency in the endeavour. Indeed, in his book The Red Atlantic, J. Sweaver notes that while these native travellers are in Britain in part because of the disruptions and upheavals of modernity, such moments of agency remind us of the degree to which native people were participants in and commentators on, not just victims or subjects of, the complex transatlantic exchanges that exemplify modernity's rise. As a commentator, few were so incisive as Pocahontas' brother-in-law and companion, Samson Acham. In his book Indigenous London, Cole Thrush writes that, quote, he had been so disappointed in the English religion, seeing little evidence of the Christian God in London, and that his time in London left him spiritually polluted with regard to his own religion. On arrival home, indeed, Samson Acham attempted to initiate an uprising against the Virginian settlers, a last damning indictment of his views of the English from experiencing their homeland. Of all of the examples I've given you today, the one that stands out is of course the first, the native performers who travelled with Buffalo Bill. In every other case, the visitors I've mentioned are travelling either when the American colonies were still under British governance, or they're travelling from homelands in Canada, where a direct relationship to the British monarchy persists. In 1887, however, Hehakasapa, or Black Elk, and his companions were very much travelling under the auspices of the American authorities. And though they were not yet American citizens, they were also no longer putative subjects of the Crown. Their case also brings that question of agency to the fore again, since they were, to all intents and purposes, prisoners of war back in the US. They volunteered to come to Europe, and they were paid for doing so. And indeed, one performer, Luther Standing Bear, both demonstrated his agency and revealed his understanding of his relationship to monarchy, when in one performance in the 1890s, he shook his spear in front of the royal box, literally in the face of Edward VII. In coming, they also participated in one of the biggest and most complex transatlantic logistical exercises to date, demonstrated their skill on horseback before crowds of tens of thousands on a twice-daily basis, and contributed directly and indirectly to growing anxieties at the heart of empire as a mirror to urban life, and what many perceived as the degeneration of a decadent, over-civilized modern society. From a British point of view, the extreme fascination of audiences from all walks of life with the native visitors is palpable. Responses that historian Alan Gallup brings to life in his vibrant accounts of Buffalo Bill's British Wild West. The performers embodied accounts of the Wild West reported in newspapers. Early advertisements illustrate the popularity of the works of James Fenimore Cooper, with posters proclaiming the impending arrival of the last of the Mohicans on British soil. While the audiences marvelled over these depictions of the clash of savage and civilised, the native performers recounted the same feelings in reverse. I could see that the Wasitchus, or white men, did not care for each other the way our people did, Black Elk would later tell his biographer John Neihardt. They had forgotten that the earth was their mother. As with many other visits, those I've mentioned and more, the native travellers' presence as well as their own observations unsettle that supposed binary of so-called savage and civilised, and throw sharp light on the inequalities and hardships of British society during the course of empire at its decline. Thank you for listening.